Good afternoon, folks. Hope you're well. It is March 2026, the 8th the Sunday, the 8th, March 2026. And I've got a few minutes, so I thought maybe I've been meaning to do something like this for quite a while, and this seems like as good a time as any. I wanted to kind of lay out some sort of to articulate largely for myself as well as anybody else who's interested, few though they may be, sort of a general plan and overall context of what I have done so far on YouTube in terms of research and what I plan on doing in terms of research. As we go through the next few months and maybe a year or two. If one were to encapsulate briefly and in a few words, my screen is dirty. In a few words, what one of my main interests in music and my activity in music, it's been largely to consider instances of mainly creative use of materials throughout musical history, particularly from the Baroque into modernism. And that's something that I intend to, there's a series of other videos and other examples of that I would like to that I'd like to consider over the next little while, and hopefully can get through all these, just probably, and maybe a few others as things occur to me, but before I kick off, as it were. I mean, everybody dies, but I'd like to leave as much of these presentations before that as possible. I'd like to think maybe I've got another few years and I might be able to get through a few of these things and other people might find them to be of interest. Now, up till now, I've looked a lot. One of my main interests and continues to be Bach's repertoire, particularly with the Bach chorales. I've a series of videos on those. And reuse of material in the Bach cantatas, particularly in the purification cantatas. And as well, and the chorales, of course, have a lot to do with text setting. And my two videos on Max Reger's work, particularly the Geistliche Lieder that I looked at a few months ago, have a lot to do with text setting and how one goes about creating an environment, which is what a setting is, that's suitable for a given given poetic text. I've also looked a little bit at in the Reger with the up until then that's something I'd never heard of the Dorian sixth. Which, from what I can tell, seems to be particularly, well, I don't know about common, but you find it fairly, well, with a degree of regularity in composers from Eastern Europe and Russia. And Prokofiev and a few others also seem to have an interest in this Dorian sixth kind of chord. I've also looked at a subset of the collections of Prokofiev's shorter piano works to see, and I've discovered, or at least I've found some interesting things to talk about in those, and particularly having to do with this concept of minor Neapolitanism, which I found to be of interest, as well as his sort of, he seems to be interested in the Neapolitan sixth chord as a structural as well as a harmonic event in several of these piano works. So those are the kinds of things that I've been dealing with up till now. And I've got a few more that are sort of more or less ready to go. Some that I've had ready on the back burner for quite a while, and some that I've just largely started and more or less ready to complete by now, and present by now. So things coming up soon. I want to look at connections between Mozart's Requiem and the Liszt choral mass, the Missa Choralis, which I performed several times during my career at Lewis University, and I've noticed some interesting things that seem to suggest connections between the Mozart Requiem and Liszt's choral mass. And there's an interesting series of when you line the chronology up of how around the time that Liszt was composing the choral mass. It's really rather interesting. His interest, particularly in Renaissance music, particularly what he thought was Palestrina but was actually Allegri, is interesting, as well as some transcriptions and arrangements made of two movements from Mozart's Requiem, the Lacrimosa and the Dies Confutatis. There are aspects of those that I find to be quite striking, and possibly, at least to me, suggests maybe reuse as arrangement and then subsequent reuse of this Mozart material in his Missa Choralis. Also, sort of thinking we're going back to Bach a little bit, back to Bach, and I've been looking. A few years ago, I worked through the Ludus Tonalis of Hindemith, and I came across what I think are some interesting rhythmic and textural things that I want to talk a little bit about and compare a few things with, and compare a few pieces of repertoire from Bach and the first fugue and prelude and fugue, the first fugue from the Ludus Tonalis. And that largely started as a question that I found in the Burckhardt about, well, why does, how do we, basically from the use of texture towards the end, particularly of large sections, as well as the conclusion of the Ludus Tonalis, and also how the rhythmically well organized it is, much like that of, say, like the first fugue of the Well-Tempered Clavier, as well as the first invention of the first C major invention. So I want to look at those a little bit. So texture and rhythm, and how perhaps, and I think I'm on reasonably solid ground when I suggest that Hindemith probably had Bach in mind when he was writing the Ludus Tonalis, not necessarily in exactly the aspects that I noticed, and however, it may very well be. But Bach is definitely in the background for the Ludus Tonalis, and this is nothing that other people haven't noticed already. Also want to put together a few piecemeal presentations on some stuff that I found in Samuel Barber's Opus 29, Hermit Songs, and I want to look particularly at Barber's reuse of material from his earlier pieces. He's quoting and referring to things that he'd written like way when he was a kid, when he was a young man, and then for various reasons got reused in later in the 50s, particularly during the Opus 29 the Opus 29 Hermit songs. So those are sort of the things that I'm kind of hoping to get to by the end of summer, at least well into those presentations. On a longer term series of things I'd like to talk a little bit about, like maybe 27 and 28 or so. I've noticed some reuse of material of 18th, 19th, and 20th century keyboard music that not necessarily are, they're not linked, like they're not, well, the composers I want to think a little bit about are Domenico Scarlatti, Edvard Grieg, and Pierre Boulez. And I'm not making direct connections between those repertoires, but I want to compare how Scarlatti seems to reuse certain compositional techniques in his 555 keyboard sonatas. I won't look at all of them, but I'll look maybe about 4 or 5 of them. Things that, and again, I have no idea whether he thought of these the way I'm thinking. I don't know, but there's some interesting, sort of procedural things that I think are interesting. Also in Grieg, Grieg's lyric pieces, there are 66 of those that he wrote over a period of roughly, I think, about 10 years or so, roughly 10 to 15 years. And there's some interesting reuses of material in those, and I can make a definite case for we have Grieg's own statements of some of the material that he used in his early lyric pieces got reused in the later lyric pieces, and interestingly enough, sort of having to do with this. Well, it smacks of a kind of, hinting at kind of a use of an of a minor Neapolitan connection between two keys. Like, say, for example, if you're in E flat major and you're going to D flat into D major, if you turn that E flat chord into a minor chord and use the third of that as the third of the enharmonically respelled, of course, you can use that as the third of D major. So you have the third of and E flat minor in D major would be a kind of flat or a minor Neapolitanism. And again, I don't want to make a whole lot of, emphasis out of this, but this seemed to be kind of interesting, especially when you look at what I kind of looked at and kind of thought a little bit about in Prokofiev. And then finally, in that sort of set of keyboard pieces I want to look at the different versions of Pierre Boulez's of his Assise, which I had the great pleasure of hearing the second American performance of the Sur Assise, the large ensemble works that Boulez derived from this small piano piece. And probably what I'll do is I'll probably compare the two piano versions. I think there are two of them. The two piano versions of these that he gradually expanded on as he worked to make longer and longer and longer parts of this. And I'd kind of like to figure out, well, how did he do that? What can we sort of observe of what we see? So that's something that will be coming down the road. I also want to look at some repertoire. Thanks to my and shout out to my people who are particularly interested in partimento and the 18th century compositional theory. I have been a long time been attracted to music by Giovanni Paisiello, and who is not only was a composer, a very successful opera composer during the 18th century, but he was also something of a teacher, and created a set of partimenti that got published during his time at the court of Catherine the Great in Russia. And he wrote a series of pieces that were I think it was a set of sonatas for 2 violins, viola, and keyboard instrument that now exist as string quartets, and I think the original 3-string plus keyboard versions also exist, and I kind of like to compare those. See how did Paisiello get from one to the other, and I think that might be kind of interesting for me at least. And then I also want to look at Paisiello being very popular, particularly as an opera composer, and also very active in the court of Napoleon Bonaparte for a while. He wrote a lot of successful operas, and a lot of composers such as Mozart, Beethoven, and of course what's his name? I'll think of it in a minute. And other composers wrote variations on themes by Paisiello, and Paisiello also wrote themes on other themes from other opera composers. And I'd kind of like to look at those a little bit. How did they get from one to the other, and why this particular opera aria of Paisiello got reused quite a bit, and why is that? Why is that? Paganini, that's it. Yeah, Paganini also wrote a set of variations on at least on the same opera aria that Beethoven did. So I thought to myself, that would be kind of fun to sort of think about and look at, consider. What does that do to my head? What do I notice? That kind of thing. And so those are sort of the kinds of things I've got kind of in mind, and plus any other things that happen to occur to me. I've never looked at a Ligeti piece, so I thought it might be fun to look at maybe one of Ligeti's solo works, like the solo viola sonata, passages of or movements of which I've just recently found in an anthology that I own. I might also do a little bit of something on parody masses in the Renaissance. I'm particularly fond myself of Lasso. I personally think that Lasso is absolutely one of the greatest composers to ever live. And I might do a little bit of looking at, comparing, and thinking about, well, what would Lasso see in these particular, pieces by either himself or other people that somehow reflect aspects of the Mass? That kind of thing. I might think about that, as well as I also kind of thinking about doing a little bit on Beethoven's. I've already looked a little bit at Beethoven's one of his, and a particularly individualistic, shall we say, almost weird in a way, variation from the Diabelli variations, and I've got this idea of possibly comparing the late and early A major piano sonatas, particularly the first movements, because they're very different from one another. One is sort of a synthesis of Haydn and Mozart. That would be the Opus 2 in A major. And then the late A major sonata, particularly the first movement, is very, very, can be seen as a foretaste of Wagner, particularly the Tristano, the preludes of Tristano and Isolde. So, on all these things have to do with, what do we notice about stuff? What, if any, commonalities do I notice? And that's really interesting. And how can this help me as a composer myself? How can thinking about this kind of reuse of material be used in my own writing as well as my own teaching? So that's kind of what I'm sort of laying out. What I think is probably going to be a sort of a program of research and thinking and considering, and hopefully interesting conversations with you guys over the next few months, maybe a few years. Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to this journey. I really am, and I'm hoping a few of you would occasionally stick your head in and maybe think about stuff and converse with me about things that we discover. Anyway, so I've talked to you off enough for now. This video is already 20 minutes long, and so I should quit for now. Anyway, that's kind of what I have in mind. Again, hope you're well, and I hope to see you and talk with you soon. And bye for now.